This is the Requiem Metal Podcast, episode 30, Converge.
That was Conduit from Converge, and welcome to the Requiem Metal Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Hundy.
And I'm Mark Rudolph.
And tonight we're going to be visiting the hardcore metalcore sounds of the Boston, Salem, Massachusetts-based band Converge. And
this is our first hardcore metalcore show.
Yeah, I mean, you could kind of cheat with Keelhaul a little bit because they have some of those elements, but they're so sludgy that it's kind of hard to...
the whole Cleveland sound. They kind of stem out of the same roots, I think, but totally different direction.
And I would say, in some ways, that even though Converge is definitely linked to the hardcore metalcore sound, they're so like experimental, and they've been able to sort of shed all the expectations that are put on so much of the metalcore, which is what's made it so utterly boring and tedious the last probably 5 or 6 years at least, if not longer.
I think my first real introduction to these guys was probably Jane Doe. Was when I was aware of them before that, and that was kind of like an exciting time when metalcore was in its infancy, and it was like, oh, this is his next new chapter in metal.
Absolutely.
And then it just kind of went down the toilet.
Yeah, I mean, bands that sort of first wave of really extreme hardcore metalcore stuff,
Botch
like
Cave-In,
Cave-In, Dillinger, and Converge was sort of on the cutting edge of all that. And if you really trace the roots back, I mean, Converge got started in the early '90s and really predated almost every single one of those other bands. Mm-hmm. And so we'd almost have to throw favor to the fact that they're kind of the foundation of this sort of transition, not just hardcore sound, but it's definitely rooted in metal. And the Conduit song that you just heard there, you've got Swedish riffs that you picked up on, a lot of Swedish death metal stuff.
Apparently they're big fans of like earache grindcore and stuff too, and Entombed, and you can kind of hear a little bit of that in the tuning of the guitars as well.
As well as I think the compositional sense that they're not writing like a lot of sort of traditional start to finish verse chorus kind of hardcore sing-song kind of songs that Earth Crisis and a lot of the Snapcase and a lot of the Victory Records stuff was really huge at the time when Converge kind of hit the scene. And I think that sort of trumped some of those early albums for me, because I had friends that were kind of into the Victory Records stuff, like Snapcase and Earth Crisis, and that was really only my gateway into hardcore, Hatebreed and some of that, which I didn't really care for Hatebreed because I just would assume listen to Bolt Thrower. But but again, so I kind of missed like the first couple albums of Converge, and I think just like you, I think I picked up, I may have picked up When Forever Comes Crashing right before Jane Doe comes out, but definitely Jane Doe is like the first super big imprint on me as well.
I think it was one of those crossover records too between metal people and hardcore people. It was when that whole scene kind of started coming together, and there's that mutual respect for, they could see like the Slayer influences and the Swedish death metal stuff, and even
like you said, like the noise, neurosis, stuff that was going on in Jane Doe. It's such a noisy record. And,
wasn't this same time like Dope Throne from Electric Wizard was coming out?
Yeah,
this like noise was really kind of pervasive in the scene at that point.
Yeah, and I remember Terrorizer magazine picked Jane Doe as their album of the year, which, I mean, for a British magazine to pick a Boston hardcore metalcore act,
it's kind of unheard of at that point.
And Terrorizer at that time was definitely the respected mag in the world. It was sort of what we attained to be when we were doing Eclipse and stuff at that time. Is if we could even match minute quality of what Terrorizer was doing, that's what And I remember Chris did a really cool interview actually with Converge around the time of Jane Doe for Eclipse. But we've had the opportunity. You and I were both saying you've seen Converge. I think we saw them together.
I've seen them twice. The first time I think we walked halfway into the set.
Yeah, and that was and they were great live. But I was so like bummed and disappointed that they only played like 4 more songs, that I really didn't get much of an experience out of it.
Yeah,
I saw them another time on what you talk about this bill today, and it's incredible. But it was Isis, Converge, Candiria, and the last band, Dillinger Escape Plan. Yeah. And they were playing in the Shelter, which is in the bottom of St. Andrews in Detroit.
And it's a tiny, tiny club. I mean, you could probably fit, 200 people in there, maybe?
Sure. And I think this was either right before Calculating Infinity came out, that really broke Dillinger, right after the Under the Running Board EP. So, like, none of those bands had really, like, hit big at that point. And maybe Cave-In was there, but I think I missed Cave-In. And I remember talking to a person that worked with us, Evie, who is a big kind of punk hardcore person, and she was like, yeah, Cave-In played a whole bunch of new material, and like everybody was booing them, and it happened to be Jupiter, which we ended up kind of loving, and then kind of going backwards into Cave-In. And apparently
a progressive record.
Yeah, apparently all the Cave-In fans at that point hated Jupiter, but then like I talked to Evie a few months later, she's like, that record's incredible. So all these bands were really what we're trying to get at, especially Converge, is these bands were breaking down the boundaries between metal, hardcore, metalcore, grindcore. I mean, they noisecore, sludgecore.
They kind of hit that. I think they hit the point creatively where like those tags didn't matter anymore. It wasn't like we got to kind of, this is our scene, we got to do this. It was just all about making like music, like that next step of extreme music.
Yeah, and I feel like they're maybe like they kind of operate in the same universe within their scene that like within the like traditional metal scene, like Opeth, Catatonia operate in. There's these bands like Mastodon, Pig Destroyer, Converge. They're like a mutt version of like all these different genres of music, and you can't really pinpoint them down with anything.
It spreads their fan base out for sure. I mean, Converge is one of the only like kind of heavier acts on Epitaph right now.
Yeah, which is, I mean, we were looking at the Epitaph website today to see if there's anything even, I mean, I guess
they had
the
Turbo
Offspring's
Negro on there
getting
for a while, but,
reissued.
They're no longer there. So.
Yeah, Turbo Negro was really the only thing I cared about. But yeah, so anyways, the band members currently today, the main guy and the guy who's sort of famous for his just incredible screaming. I mean, it's one of the more elusive features of Converge is Jacob Bannon, and he writes all the lyrics and does a lot of the visuals, especially all the album covers that you see today. And just like when we were talking about last week on the Cathedral podcast, like, Converge's covers are so iconic nowadays. And
the Jane Doe cover totally kind of like set the blueprint for the next 5 years of graphic design for metal and hardcore.
Mm-hmm. It certainly had a big influence, I think, on Aaron Turner and the stuff that he does for Hydra Head Records. But and then Kurt Ballou is on guitar, and I think he does some of the keyboards and other experimental sounds. And he's actually, I think, produced the last couple records that we'll be hearing at the end of the show, and kind of really thickened the sound up. And then Nate Newton was on bass guitar, and I think he used to be in a band called Jesuit, but I think they had they started off with other bass players, like the guy you heard play on Conduit there was actually Mr. Steve Brodsky from Cave-In, and
from Steve Brodsky's solo fame.
Oh, that is true, of his 4-track recordings. And then Ben Kohler on drums, and he's been in a series of different bands. I think he even played in Cave-In at one point, but I can't remember when he joined, because they had a drummer for quite a while, I thought. Just up until 99, I guess. Damon Bilardo and John DiGiorgio. So, just like a lot of bands, kind of a revolving door of drummers, came in. But Ben Kohler in particular, especially the stuff he does post Jane Doe, is just so incredible. But they're really a unique, 4-piece in terms of their musical vision, and a lot of these guys playing a lot of different other bands, Old Man Gloom, and they've got all these associations within the scene and side projects galore. And Jake Bannon's running Death Wish Records, so these guys are incredibly involved in the scene in such a profound level that we thought this would probably be the most appropriate band to start out with in terms of introducing metalcore, because Mark and I's metalcore, we're about as picky as metalcore fans as you're going to find. If I can even call myself a fan anymore, I don't really.
Just that first wave of Hydra Head stuff, and I mean, there's a couple of the escape artist acts, and there's really not much that has much staying power. I kind of cut loose a lot of that stuff out of my collection years ago.
And I think when it really broke into the mainstream is when I sort of broke out in some ways. I mean,
the bands that were really garnering a lot of the attention just. They didn't have the kind of dynamicism as some of these acts did.
Well, they were safe, from Autumn to Ashes and some of these bands. Like they were listenable, and they might have had a couple heavy riffs here and there.
I think that was kind of like the Hot Topic era of metalcore.
And it still sort of is in some capacity. I mean, there's a lot of bands like Chiodos from this area, from Michigan, that you talk to a lot of high school kids, and they're all tabbing.
Well, it's all
Chiodos.
about, you're at that age and you discover that band, so it's something, you glom onto it. You don't care about the history of the stuff. So.
Yeah, and I think hardcore in metalcore in particular is really done well through the MySpace, Facebook, kind of generating interest and stuff.
Well, a friend of ours, Mark Coughlin, that runs Sour Ghost Records, I mean, that was kind of his entry point into metal, and he kind of went all over the map after that point. So.
And he certainly opened himself up, just like Converge, to more esoteric kind of stuff. He's brought in the Neurosis, ISIS kind of influence stuff, or Neurisis as they call the the genre nowadays. But Conduit, the song we start off with, is from the early era, and the early era of Converge, really their first 2, I guess, official full-length records, which is Petitioning the Empty Sky, which was put out in 97, and When Forever Comes Crashing. Those 2 were definitely, you heard a lot of Slayer riffs, and you heard a lot of cool time changes and different things that were unique to metalcore.
Well, the most quintessential things, the discordant riff. That
absolutely.
We'll hear
and some of the just driving drums that were so prevalent on these first few records.
I should mention, I don't think I've seen few bands that have had as much energy live as these guys, next to maybe Dillinger, but I've only seen Dillinger post the original singer.
Oh, okay. So
back
in the early days of Dillinger, I mean, they threw chairs and stuff.
They were beating the hell out of each other, and Band looked like he was just gargling razor blades when he was screaming, through the show. And I mean, just to be that chaotic on stage, but yet maintain some kind of semblance of playing your instrument, it was pretty impressive.
Well, and then you read interviews with him too, and he's quite a funny guy, even though
he's really down to earth and kind of mellow.
His lyrics are so intense, but yet, like you said, he's very mellow and stuff. But Converge, musically, I mean, they were kind of you know, they were influenced by bands like Rorschach, which members of Rorschach went on and formed like Kiss It Goodbye and Plain Enemy and stuff. But there wasn't really much of this going on in the early 90s. I mean, you know, you had all those scenes that we've already talked about, you know, the Florida death metal scene and stuff. And you had like this sort of Victory style, like, yo, kind of like bouncing hardcore, which was so perfected
New York
by
hardcore stuff.
Yeah, and really this sort of weird Boston scene came out of nowhere, and you had bands like Cave-In, which if you played Cave-In or Converge on these early records, for any metal fan, they'd be like, yeah, this is cool, you know?
Yeah.
Like, my first thought wasn't that it was hardcore. My first thought was it was cool metal, but it had, like, some different, unique things going on. It wasn't typical metal.
It had that intensity of, like, that first era, like, Siege and Deep Wound, you know, that kind. And that stuff came from the same area, didn't it?
Yeah,
Siege out of Boston?
I think so, possibly.
At least East Coast.
Yeah, and I can't remember where Deep Wound's from. You know, there was Jay Mascis from Dinosaur
Might have been
Jr.'s
from
first
Ohio.
band. Okay, yeah. Sounds about right. Sounds about right. Yeah, we'll have to check into that. But these two records were put on Equal Vision Records, and preceding them was Halo in the Haystack and Carrying and Killing, which I don't have Halo in the Haystack, and I do have Carrying and Killing. But Carrying and Killing was like a bunch of demos and things that were kind of put out on this record.
Okay, yeah, that's something I don't have.
And I think Hydra had actually put that out. Yeah, so. Again, they're part of this growing sort of Boston scene that's really gonna, you know, bands like ISIS and Cave-In and Converge, you know, really put Boston on the map for being the nucleus for like new stuff, new types of hardcore, really, you know, a new way to approach it. You know, it's no longer just mimicking like Black Flag, you know, and Minor Threat.
Yeah, avant-garde scene that was happening there really with it.
And if you're listening to like a lot of Hydra Head records today, you can tell like that avant-gardism is in some ways kind of gone over the edge. You know, it's almost maybe too avant-garde, but it's cool. You know, it's kind of like the Southern Lord scene. You know, started off very experimental and is now it's like kind of hit or miss. Like, do I really need like, you know, a bunch of monkeys playing like drums in like a cave and, you know, experimenting with, you know, Kanye and stuff.
Fill up, John Cage and the can and stuff back in, you know, years ago. So.
Sure. But anyways, we're gonna kind of bust into their old era before we get into the Jane Doe and post Jane Doe stuff. And in this first set that we're gonna hear is kind of the quintessential like early Converge song. And you notice that on Saddest Day it opens with, I mean, you even pointed out, you said that's like the quintessential like metalcore riff. Dun, 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 you know, it's very like discordant, but yeah, like catchy.
I think it's like a backward. I mean, it's a riff that doesn't sound right. I mean, it just kind of like makes you feel uncomfortable right off the bat.
Absolutely.
And the stop start mixed with that, you didn't really hear anything like that in metal before.
No.
Maybe a little bit in punk and stuff, but not to that degree.
Yeah, and like I said, like they kind of put it on the map, and then like bands like Botch really came in, and Dillinger. I mean, you know, all these bands that you know probably deserve their own show and maybe will down the road, but you know, like, but this was really the touchstone of where it all kind of got started. And in Saddest Day, like I was mentioning that Decibel just did their top 50 kind of riffs of all time, and this was the Converge representative was Saddest Day in this opening riff in particular. And so we're going to play a pair of songs from Petitioning the Empty Sky, that Saddest Day and Forsaken, which both have are just doused in Slayer influence. But in particular, Saddest Day, you pointed out how you heard Dismember, like an ever-flowing stream.
Yeah, there's total
Override the Overture kind
Swedish
of
death metal riff going on there. Then there's a weird breakdown toward the end where everything seems like it's kind of falling apart and everybody's just kind of screaming. It's almost like a soundtrack of a bus accident or something.
Yeah, which is really predictive of what they do on Jane Doe, where it really sounds like like you don't know what's going to happen. Like the whole song's like deconstructing within itself, and
they're just going to veer off at any moment. It's just totally
which Neurosis is really good at, and I think maybe they were listening to some of that at this time. And then we're going to hear a couple more tunes from When Forever Comes Crashing, Year of the Swine, and Towing Jehovah, which has an awesome ending. So enjoy a set of older Converge here on Requiem Metal Podcast. That was Towing Jehovah, Year of the Swine, Forsaken, and The Saddest Day. And we were both kind of observing something about the end of Towing Jehovah. What were you hearing there?
The whole the minor chordish catatonia, like the repetitive kind of riff.
Yeah, where it was sort of like, it just has this sort of darkness to it, you know, that you heard like in more of the doomy stuff.
Funny how you said it went on, Botch ended up kind of using that as one of their signature kind
on C. Thomas Howell's The Soul Man, you know, in particular. That's kind of what hooked me on Botch when I heard a catatonia riff in the midst of a hardcore song. I was like, oh, you know. But this is sort of, again, even though it's so drenched in obvious metal influences and Swedish metal, and we just mentioned catatonia and some other things, Converge really hasn't quite found their total sound at this point, and they do a couple things. They do a split with Agoraphobic Nosebleed, I think, during this era, like 99, so right after
Poacher Diaries.
Yeah, the Poacher Diaries stuff, and so they're kind of doing some things here, and they kind of take a hiatus in terms of full lengths. There's a 3-year hiatus, which is kind of strange for Converge, because they've been putting albums out pretty much every year up until this point. And then they come back with Jane Doe, and of course Jane Doe, like you said before, not just visually, but like just artistically, it's the crossover.
Everything
album.
came together.
And
I mean, the previous couple albums, I mean, if you start out with Jane Doe, it's so much more focused, and the older stuff's kind of all over the place. I think they weeded out or filtered all their ideas kind of down into a unique vision for this record.
Because it's almost like one precise song, just cut into like kind of different movements. And you know, each song has its own sort of personality, but it almost has like one sound, like throughout. You know, it's got this one tone that's always sort of going.
Well, the production's fairly unique, I think, for the time too. It's incredibly condensed, and there's a lot of, like, I'm pretty sure Bannon's using a lot of gain on his vocals. I mean, it's just
some of the harsh
vocals.
And I remember in particular when I was living with Brian, and this was when, you know, Mark and I really started hanging out a lot, and he got involved in the magazine and stuff. But we had these kind of D-bag neighbors that lived upstairs. I think we called them like Oleander and
typical college guys that do push-ups, listen to Candlebox and stuff. And
so we would turn our speakers up and facing because they lived above us, we'd flip our speakers up and just blast the heck out of this whole record. And then like Brian and I would dive down, so we'd be below the speakers. We'd be kind of crawling around the ground, and it was right before we were moving out. We just wanted to annoy the heck out of these guys, and you know, the way that the concubine, it comes out at you, it's just like it attacks. I mean, it's almost like slits your throat and just like leaves you for dead. And I know this was definitely one of those songs or one of these records you could put on if you wanted to chase people out of a party. It certainly fits that. But you know, I think what's cool about this album too is it really, like you said before, it brought in not just metal fans over to their side. I think it really started to get some indie appeal though too, because it was so noisy that there was sort of that like fringe group of people that were always interested in kind of noise rock and like the Swans and some of the kind of weird stuff like that kind of like globbed onto it. So you started to see like Alternative Press and like other I mean, you could Spin magazine, probably, like, you know,
see some like Pixies influence and stuff in the record as well. I mean, it kind of, I don't know if it pulled over that crowd per se, but it branched itself out enough to where I think critics kind of tapped into a lot of that stuff.
And there's moments in this, and you'll hear it like in songs like Broken Vow or Jane Doe that are beautiful. I mean, they're very catchy, and it's way catchier than almost anything they've done before. On some extreme, it's like the harshest thing they've ever done, but then the other extreme of it is that it's like, you know, incredibly commercial in a lot of ways.
I mean, the whole thing's just kind of like emotion let loose. To all extents.
And I remember when Chris did an interview with Converge for this album with Jacob, and he was talking about essentially, I mean, it's a breakup album, you know? I mean, this is breakup core, whatever you want to call it, which is some ridiculous subgenre of metalcore.
Red Roses for a Blue Lady.
Yes, how can we forget them? And what's cool about it is, I think, it's an angry record, obviously, because of the breakup factor, and I think Jane Doe is obviously a reference to, like, you know, you're kind of lost to me. You're almost an unidentified body in some ways. You know, like you're nothing to me. You're a faceless kind of woman. You know, I mean, because Jane Doe is kind of the terminology for like an unidentified like dead body of some sort. So, you know, if you're looking for where the connotations are coming from, that's kind of what's happening here. So. But in particular, pay attention to the closing song, which is sort of one of their true epics, and really starts this pattern that you're going to see on their last 3 records, where they almost have like an epic centerpiece on each song.
The anthem song for each record.
And it's the title track, and it's Jane Doe, and you should hear some ISIS, neurosis kind of things going on. But we're going to open up with the 1-2 punch of Concubine and Fault and Fracture, and then we're going to go to your favorite tune,
Homewrecker.
Yeah, what is it in particular that kind of globs you on this one?
The barking vocals, the yahs that, I mean, almost through this thing, his vocals just kind of devolve into just barking, almost. There's no discernible, lyrics going on there, but
yeah,
and it's got a great hook in the song too.
Sure. And speaking of great hooks, Broken Vow at the very end has some really cool kind of repetitive chatter stuff that really just sort of builds and drives, and it all sort of drives into Jane Doe, the title track. So enjoy Concubine and Fault and Fracture from Converge's Jane Doe.
Stay!
That was Jane Doe, Broken Vow, Homewrecker, Fault and Fracture, and we open things up with the Anger of Concubine. And the next thing that we're going to get into is going to be You Fail Me, the next full length that they put out. But in between Jane Doe and You Fail Me, they put out another collection of sort of demos and early recordings and things like that. And also, I think, a couple of original songs or re-recordings of some sort. And it was put out in Jacob's label Death Wish, and it was called Unloved and Weeded Out. Another happy title about love and kind of in that vein.
I think there's about 20 or 30 albums named that. But.
Yeah. And in particular, there was 2 songs on there that I was sort of, we were kind of leaning on wanting to play, Downpour, and really a cool tune, which is Flowers and Razor Wire. But Flowers and Razor Wire, another happy romance.
Good dichotomy there.
Happy romance song. So, and then they, again, take a 3-year break before they put out a proper full length, and they really kind of shocked people.
They did a ton of touring for Jane Doe, too. I mean, the Jane Doe sweatshirt, the gray sweatshirt with the guns on it in a circle,
which I still have my kind of baseball 3/4 length shirt of.
Yeah,
that.
I mean, I saw more of those than any other shirt ever, I think.
And I think, again, this is a testament, as a visual artist, what Jacob was able to achieve with that cover of Jane Doe. That, I mean, he really sort of put. It
was the high contrast monochromatic thing was going on. That kind of pushed that whole thing forward. He's actually kind of stayed with it, and it hasn't seemed derivative at all.
Yeah. So I mean, you as an artist, I mean, what's your view on his take on artwork? I mean, is it rank up there for you?
Totally. Yeah, and I've tried to I've used some of that aesthetic in a lot of the jazz layouts I've done. I think it's got a good crossover with that original Blue Note stuff that had that great photography, just high contrast photography with straight color. I mean, that kind of stuff, the more iconic you can have a cover, the better, I think.
Yeah, and certainly you can almost stare, you can walk past, and if you see a Converge cover, you know it's Converge.
Yeah, I mean, on You Fail Me, it doesn't even have the band title on the cover, and you can tell it's a Converge right off the bat.
Just sort of a hand with some kind of visual detached blood kind of gore coming out of it, but it's not even really gory. It's almost like
it's like a Grey's Anatomy thing, not the stupid TV show, but the actual
the book. Great, yeah, the book it was based off of. But You Fail Me, this was for both Mark and I, this was such an utter change from Jane Doe that this is something that when I bought, I kind of filed it away and didn't really pull it out for a long time. I
haven't listened to it very much at all. And it was such, there wasn't that huge excitement after, it was so many years later. I'd heard so many other things. It was like, oh, it came out, I was working at the record store, I'll pick it up.
And at this point, I was gone from the record store teaching, so like I kind of had to listen to this on my own, free of that. When you work at a record store, you kind of have that like nurturing environment of like.
Well, it's like what CD you bring your stack of CDs in, and you're constantly going through stuff
and talking music all day with people.
Yeah,
and I didn't have that anymore. And this sort of like I picked it up at a record store near me and kind of probably listened to it once and was like, oh, this doesn't sound like Jane Doe.
Yeah, it didn't hit you over the head.
And that's really sad. It's a very subtle, kind of record, but it's also like slower. It's more insidious in some ways. And I was telling Mark where the record where it kind of like finally hit me was I was jogging at night to this record a couple times, and it was just sort of like an eeriness when it gets to a couple of songs that we're going to be hearing, In Her Shadow and You Fail Me, which are two of the more like neurosis-y kind of like just darker, slower building kind of songs that I really sort of, whoa, this is a cool record. It's just completely different, you know?
Yeah.
And in particular, you said you heard some Keel Hall stuff that was going on here.
The drumming's a lot more complex and more. It's not just a rhythm element, but it's just built. It's a lot more textured and.
And it's a really neat. They really kind of take the build of the Jane Doe song that we just ended things with a moment ago, and they kind of use this idea of deconstructing music and watching it sort of rip apart and fall apart in the midst of the songs. But then they also go back to like the song we're going to open things up with, Last Light, to some really like awesome, like kind of catchy, clean sing along kind of stuff. And it's just, I really feel like this is the most comfortable record they've made up until this point.
Yeah.
It's not as focused as Jane Doe, but it's very diverse and very open in order to kind of do
I think
stuff.
it actually has the ability to have singles on it, too. Instead of Jane Doe, it was almost like it was a whole record you'd listen to for the experience.
Yeah, so this is the Empire to the Jane Doe's Operation Mindcrime, if
there
you will.
Go. If you want to it.
Yeah, so anyways, we're gonna hear Last Light. You Fail Me, the title track, which in particular has a real Neurosis kind of feel, and then the kind of country vibe-ish, eerie inspired In Her Shadow, and then end things with Eagles Become Vultures. Yeah, very lo-fi-ish. So, and then end things with Eagles Become Vultures.
I need you to be alone.
That was Eagles Become Vultures, Inner Shadow, You Fail Me, and Last Light from the 2004 release, You Fail Me. And we were noticing when we listened to Eagles Become Vultures, it had the very much like a Cleveland sludge rock kind of feel to it, almost like Boulder, which is a band you're kind of dig on.
That riff that's just like the total balls out AC/DC style riff. Almost.
Yeah, and a very Melvin's influence, which is again another band that Jake Bannon has sort of acknowledged as being influential on him. And when you
what
take
good band in the last like 20 years hasn't been influenced? That's
true.
Like Nirvana's number one influence and all that kind of stuff too. They're like one of the most unsung bands out there.
And I've told Mark that I'm up for the challenge someday of trying to put together some kind of a Melvins show. We might have to just focus on like 3 records and be like, yeah, here's 3 records from the Melvins. If you like these, go find some other stuff. But
yeah, their back catalog is
ridiculous.
It's enormous.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. So we're gonna end things tonight with some stuff from their last full length, which came out in 2006, and this is a return to the angrier side of Jane Doe in a lot of ways. Outside of like 2 songs, which we'll hear the 2 kind of songs that are anti kind of Jane Doe. But the 2 tunes we're going to open things up with are Sacrifice and Vengeance. And I mean, they're short, sweet, and they're just like punch right towards the gut. And this record and the title itself, No Heroes, is really about kind of really the failure of like America at this point. And luckily, we're recording this podcast after a Tuesday that's actually maybe brought hope to the finally back to the United States with the election of Obama. But at this point, when he wrote it in 2006, I mean, this was like the grimmest period of the Iraq War, and it just seemed like we were going to be stuck with Bush and all this crap forever. Yeah. And lyrically, that's where he's coming from with like a lot of this stuff, and sort of a song like Sacrifice and Vengeance, and it's all about survival. And the song, well, I don't want to give away, but the song we're going to end the whole show with is called Trophy Scars, which is really just about his survival from the beginning of the hardcore movement to now. But it can be used metaphorically as like, Jesus, we've been through like so much through this horrible period.
That's the only bad side I can see to Obama being elected president is the arts. There's not anything to be mad about anymore.
Yeah, I was gonna say, punk rock's gonna have nothing to do. We're gonna have, movies can't rally against anything.
Yeah, because look at the early '90s. When Clinton was in office, it was just like there's not a whole lot memorable that came out then. Outside of Swedish death metal stuff.
Yeah. Well,
that was just all about zombies.
Exactly. But and then we're gonna play those 2 songs, Sacrifice and Vengeance, and then we're gonna go to kind of the epic tune of the record, which is Grimheart Black Rose. And this song really kind of caught me off guard right when I heard it, because I had no idea that they were gonna have Jonah from Only Living Witness singing duet on it, and his vocals are unmistakable. If you're a fan of Only Living Witness, or if you've never heard him before, you'll definitely enjoy this. I can't think of anyone that would really not like his vocals.
No, they're another one of those bands that just nobody knew about.
Yeah.
But everybody liked him when they heard him.
Yeah, kind of like Quicksand and stuff.
They're touted years after they broke up.
But so we're going to end things with that, and then we'll come back and say our goodbyes. So enjoy stuff from No Heroes, Sacrifice, Vengeance, and Grimheart Black Rose. That was Grim Heart, Black Rose, the epic with Jonah from Only Living Witness. And then we opened things up with a kind of 1-2 punch of Sacrifice and Vengeance.
Not the Bathory cover of Sacrifice.
Yeah, that would be cool. Converge has done a few. I think they've done like a Black Flag cover. I haven't heard many covers that they've done in particular that I can think of.
Yeah, at least not in recorded albums. But
we're going to close things out tonight with kind of a cool song that kind of sums up almost in a way like all these sort of quintessential elements that Converge has: the clean stuff, the traditional hardcore, the more like sort of dissonant, discordant aspects, the noisier things, along with sort of just the catchy, we can write whatever we want kind of freedom that Converge has been afforded. And this is another song off of No Heroes, and I was telling Mark that this song would have made a better or more appropriate album closer, but obviously Jacob was going for something different, probably thematically.
Yeah.
In terms of like good show closing numbers, this is a good one. It's Trophy Scars, so that's what we're gonna kind of be closing things out with. But we hope you've enjoyed this sort of guide to the world of hardcore, metalcore, our introduction into it. Let us know what you think, because again, this is a new genre for us to try. And if we missed a couple tunes, I know there's really kind of diehard Converge fans out there that we may have pissed off because we.
Or they may not even be listening to the podcast, given our track record so far.
That's true. So if you do enjoy it, just shoot us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com. We'd love the feedback. Or, give us some feedback on iTunes.
Or give us a plug on your blog.
Yeah.
That would be fantastic.
We've tried to kind of open things up, the conversation on the Decibel Forum a little bit, and that's worked in some capacities, but in other ways, some people, I think, are maybe... they're just like, oh, what's a metal podcast? And if you're
it's weird. Just looking at our stats, we get consistently more people every time, but every single week when I look at these things, we've got people downloading every episode.
Yeah,
so it's got that cumulative effect too, which. It's nice to be a podcast that people hang on to.
Sure.
For historical. It's not just like a weekly news wrap-up kind of thing.
Yeah, so. And then you just delete it and throw it in your trash box. So, anyways, we're going to close things out here with Trophy Scars from Converge's No Heroes. And, again, give us some feedback. But we hope you've enjoyed the show. So, for Jason.
And Mark.
Keep on metal.